we're stoked, man, because 2023 was awesome, as we talked about in our last podcast, but now it's time to look forward to 2024. And we figured we'd start the year with three big fights that we want to see in the new year. And I think we should just kick it right off and talk about the first one, which is probably the most obvious one. And that is Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad 2 for the welterweight title. It needs to happen. I mean, can it really be anyone else? I get that Shavkat is there, but 18-0, all finishes. The UFC has to like that, right? And Shavkat has such a crazy fan base from Kazakhstan. I think that he's always going to be in play for a title fight. But don't you agree that like this fight just needs to happen already?
Yeah, and some tells me too that Leon Edwards himself feels like this needs to happen. Like he just needs to,
You don't
put
think
away
Bilal
for
thinks it needs to happen? You don't think he's said it enough?
No,
He's been going crazy
yeah,
lately.
with Bilal at this point, you have to actually be living under a rock to not know that he is absolutely obsessed with literally just getting this opportunity, which we haven't even like heard, other than that he would be weighing in as the backup fighter, that he would be getting the shot. But I think Leon definitely, like, no, I think he made it clear, like, Bilal, like, I would squash you, it wouldn't be a contest, like, pretty much
The
like
tweets that
yeah.
Leon's been on fire lately. And honestly, Bilal has been pretty funny too. I mean, the only thing I don't like that like what Bilal will do sometimes is that he'll be on podcasts and he'll like discredit others to bring himself up. But like, dude's on a 10-fight unbeaten streak, which is second only to Leon, who's the champion. And like, you don't like, I saw a video of him today tearing down like Kamaru Usman's resume. I'm like, why do you got to do that? Like, no one's even talking about Usman versus Leon again. Like, you're the guy. Everybody knows that you're the guy. Like, even if you don't like Bilal, you kind of have to admit that it's just his time. I mean, these two guys, like I said, they're on the two biggest unbeaten streaks in the division. They have history from that first fight with the eye poke and the no contest. It's the only blemish on both of their streaks. This fight needs to happen. Like, this is clearly a beef. I don't think it's personal. I think it's just more competitive. But all signs have pointed to this. And it's crazy to me that the UFC hasn't been more, I guess, willing to say that this fight is on the agenda.
Yeah.
But I think it is.
Well, now that UFC 296 has passed, what better card to have it on than UFC 300? Like, in which case, Belal Muhammad doesn't even have to be the main event. So,
yeah,
that's what we're trying to figure out.
We were talking a little about UFC 300 before we started here and, like, what we think could possibly happen there. And people, this is, like, what I have to say for both hardcore and casual fans. They need to, like, lower their expectations in terms of, like, how big the main event is going to be, because GSP is not fighting again unless I think they offer him the company, because he said he's not going to fight any day over or after he turns 40. Then you think of Ronda Rousey. I don't see her coming back. It just doesn't seem likely at all. And then the other big name that people were throwing out there is Brock Lesnar, who I really don't think we see come back ever. And that only leaves you with Conor McGregor, because they haven't built like another huge pay-per-view star really since being on ESPN. Like, you could argue Israel Adesanya, but they're not going to give him a main event without a title fight. He's not, like, he's a draw, but he's not a Conor McGregor draw. And like, I want you to give me your opinion on this card that I was talking to you about before we started. So like, Dana White was talking about how UFC 300 is going to be super stacked from the first fight of the night to the main event, and like, people aren't going to believe that like some of the prelims are on the prelims and the main card is what it is. So assuming that this card is as huge as he's saying it's going to be, I'm going to guess that Sterling Cater, Yuri Rakic, and Bo Nickel versus Brundage are all going to be on the prelims. They might not be, but just for this argument, let's assume they are. So I still think UFC 300 main event is McGregor versus Chandler. I mean, they've been back and forth, McGregor and like in the UFC and the media, but this is what happens every time Conor McGregor fights. You think about when he fought Poirier back in 2021, it was literally the exact same thing. Like, the UFC doesn't want to put me in there. I'll fight Manny Pacquiao, and then he fights Poirier in January and rematches him in July that year, and he's been out ever since. Now we get fast forward to the end of 2023, early 2024. He's saying the exact same things. Dana's saying they're gonna work something out, and I think they have to because UFC 300 needs that huge name. And I get that McGregor hasn't been winning every fight as of late, obviously, and it's been so long since he fought, but it just makes sense. But then after that, as we alluded to, this is like, to go back to the fight we were talking about. That's kind of why I think that Edwards versus Muhammad 2 will be on 300, because for some reason, like, it just doesn't seem like they want Bilal to get that title fight, because they put Colby in ahead of him, which was, people like Colby and some people hate Colby, but it made sense, I guess, pay-per-view wise. But Bilal deserves the shot, and if they really don't think that it's going to sell a crazy amount of pay-per-views, it would just make sense to put him on such a big card like this. And then my other three fights, I think Alexa Grasso versus Zhang Weili. My reasoning behind that is that they just booked Blanchfield versus Fiorot about 2 weeks before UFC 300, which makes me think, well, who else would they have Grasso fight? I don't think it's going to be Valentina again, but I guess it's possible. So Grasso and Zhang have been talking on social media. I just think it's possible because of that. My big surprise one would be Poirier versus Diaz, because they've kind of been talking, and I think Nate Diaz returning to the UFC is inevitable. And then my last one that I really think is going to happen, and I think it would make a crazy main card opener, is Israel Adesanya versus Hamzat Chimaev. It just seems like momentum is pointing towards that fight at 185. So I've said my piece. That was obviously a long rant. What do you think of that card?
Well, to me, like, it sounds like it's got pretty much like about everything, any kind of fight fan could ask for. You're getting the main event, obviously a huge superstar return, against one of the younger names that UFC has had for has they been able to sign in Michael Chandler. You got you got another welterweight challenger going up and fighting for that title. You have a champion versus champion. You get obviously with Dustin Poirier and Nate Diaz, like that is I feel like that's some sort of blast to the past, where I think those guys probably gonna like be really up for one another, and just at their points in their careers, I guess maybe to a lesser degree with Dustin Poirier. I feel like Dustin Poirier definitely still has a lot more to give, and could very well get back in that lightweight title picture. But depending on how the fight with Nate Diaz would go, we would have to wait and see after that. And then he came out at for one with Israel Adesanya. For one, we didn't even know how long he would be gone for after losing the title again. So it would I hopefully UFC 300 especially, it's still crazy to think about how, what if they don't get Conor McGregor for this card, and it's like, oh no, who's going to be the second biggest star that they can possibly get for this card? And
Yeah.
just for that fight alone with Hamza, I feel like both of those two could just really put on a fight no one will ever forget. And if that's the opening fight to the card, then fine, you're in for something. You're in for something really, something that you won't be seeing for, definitely won't be seeing for a while, if ever again, after it happens. So
Yeah. And like I said, I think that the UFC, they need to embrace that, or UFC fans rather, they need to embrace that this card may not be the most stacked at the very top, but I think that it's going to be crazy from beginning to end. So if I was a fan really wondering where this card is going to go, expect it to be crazy, but I don't expect one of these older big names to come out of the woodworks and be like, oh my God, this person's coming back. Because they, like you were kind of saying, I really think they need that McGregor fight to headline this card.
And the thing is, too, with such a special pay-per-view like this one, it's we just obviously we're going over 3 fights that need to happen. So if you're really gonna put Bilal and Leon Edwards on there, then it's all these other fights are pretty much, it's if these guys are gonna agree, then everything should be going easy. And it's feel like it would be nice to know about these fights happening sooner rather than later. But if they still have to quote unquote work things out with Conor McGregor, and obviously you got to get a hold of an Nate Diaz and whatnot, and then that Izzy and Hamzat fight, which obviously would take place at 185. Like, I think everything else just comes pretty easily. So
And it kind of brings us right into our second fight, and it's not really as cut and dry as the first fight, but we've been talking about him so much just now. Really, another fight in 2024 that needs to happen is not just McGregor versus Chandler, but Conor McGregor versus anyone at this point. Whether because we were talking about Nate Diaz, that's always a possibility. The trilogy between them. I mean, this wouldn't be the first time that Conor McGregor has left a fellow tough coach in the lurch. He didn't fight Uriah Faber in the end of all that. So, and I think Chandler is starting to get to the point where he needs to fight someone, and that's why he was talking about Nate Diaz himself. I still believe
yeah,
that McGregor Chandler will happen, but I think if it doesn't happen at UFC 300, then it's a bit more unlikely because Michael Chandler knows that he needs to get a fight. I mean, you said he was like a younger acquisition. I know you meant that in terms of like how recently they got him, but in terms of his age, I'll look this up for sure right now, but he's in his late 30s, Michael Chandler. Let me just double check how he's 37 right now. And his birthday, it's weird, it doesn't say it like right up. April 24th, so he would be turning 38 like a little bit after UFC 300. So if that fight doesn't happen there, he's running out of time to get himself back into the title picture. And he is a guy who can be there really at any point. But Conor McGregor, we know this, he runs to the beat of his own drum. We really never know exactly what he's thinking. Him and his team play a lot of mind games, and that's kind of why I feel like we're closer to this fight than he's leading on. I just think it's publicity to try and build it before the announcement, which could happen maybe on New Year's. Who knows? It just feels like that might happen. I mean, we were planning on talking about Conor McGregor a lot, but we figured just in case there's an announcement that's going to come between when we record this and when this video comes out, maybe we should keep it a little more open-ended. And I still believe it, like I said, it's Conor versus anyone, but I still believe it's McGregor Chandler UFC 300. That's the fight to make. I mean, who else? Like I said, who else is going to headline that card? And you said it best. It's a very special event. It would just make sense to have Conor McGregor headline. I mean, they could have had him versus Nate Diaz on UFC 200, but things got in the way of that. I think we need to see Conor McGregor on such a huge card like this. I mean, he's earned that at least.
and maybe they can use this card going forward to like really put that emphasis back on building these pay-per-view stars and whatnot. And like, it's not like you're gonna have the shortage of like the best of the best to be able to do that with starting with this card. So
Do you think that the UFC has thought about that, like in the lead up to this? Because I feel like until now it's been, obviously we've had some great pay-per-views, but in terms of, like I said, those mega events like a McGregor Habib, we don't really have those as often, I guess, anymore. And I kind of feel like now that we're getting towards UFC 300, maybe like it's starting to creep into their minds, like, oh wait, if Conor doesn't headline this card, like we don't know if there's anything that we could make that would be such a big spectacle.
and then yeah, especially, and it would be especially more important in that case, 'cause it's like, all right, well, if you don't have Connor for this card, then are you gonna have Connor for any card going forward? And then obviously with Michael Chandler too, we just spoke about, he's getting up there in age, his time is running out for that title shot. So uh
Yeah, I would just love to see it, man. I think it makes sense. And McGregor, love him or hate him, he's been a huge part of the UFC's success, which is why I'd want to see him on such a special pay-per-view event. It just makes the most sense. Like, even if you don't think that McGregor should ever fight for the title again, you got to admit that this dude deserves a spot on what's
yeah,
going to be one of the biggest cards in the promotion's
it could
history.
even come with the prelims too, man. I mean, the three fights that were already announced, like, in this case, I'd say especially with Bo Nickel and Cody Brundage, like those two put on a great fight. Obviously, if you get, it's no secret that Bo Nickel is a heavy favorite right now. He'll probably be a heavy favorite going in. Like Bo Nickel puts on another just absolute grappling clinic. Maybe shows that, maybe shows up a little with that more improved striking and whatnot on the feet. Then you got a guy right there. Honestly, that a lot of people are already, well aware of, and then it's just up to him to just keep putting on these impressive finishes. So.
Yeah, and like I said, any of those three fights, they could be on the main card, and I don't think any fan would complain. They're all amazing fights. The card that I've made up in my head is more so just like, if they're saying that this is going to be like the biggest event in UFC history, that just makes me think that they have to have bigger fights than that on the main card. And it's crazy to think that there's bigger fights than like Aljamain Sterling going up to 145 or Yuri versus Rakic, and like you said, building a star like Bo Nickel. But at the same time, it would just be like a good pay-per-view if that's really on the main card. But if they're saying that this is going to be one of the biggest events in the company's history, I feel like we see crazy fights on this main card. That's if they can get it done, though. That's the big thing. But I say we move on to the last of our big three fights that we want to see in 2024. And this one goes outside of the UFC over to the PFL. And that is a fight that we've talked about a few times on here. Chris Cyborg versus Kayla Harrison. Despite me thinking that Grasso versus Zhang is a huge fight, I still think this is the biggest fight that can happen in women's MMA. These two have been talking to each other for literally years at this point, between the PFL and Bellator rivalry, like who's really the number two promotion. And Cyborg and Harrison were like two of the biggest stars, and now both promotions are together. I think Cyborg still has to fight Larissa Pacheco, right? Because she was the champion for PFL. I think they said that they still want to do that first. And it makes sense. Like, I get that. And assuming that Cyborg can get through Pacheco, I think that this is the fight that's going to happen. Probably in the latter part of 2024, but hey, man, better late than never. It's been teased so many times, and these girls they clearly want it. Like, they clearly want this fight. So, I don't know, man. Do you think that this is the biggest fight in women's MMA? I don't know if you agree with me on that, because that might be a hot take.
No, yeah. I think, like, especially, if you can get the year, just the fight, MMA as a whole, if you can get the year started with the Alexa Grasso and Zhang Weili fight, and have that go as well as everyone hopes, and then you can have this fight in the other promotion to, I feel like in that case, you're really restoring and building back, like, that huge premier spotlight to women's MMA that has kind of been lacking seemingly recently. And, like, in this case with these two, in Kayla Harrison's case, obviously trying to get that her hand raised over a legendary opponent in her own right, and then even with Cyborg, because we just, it was good that you mentioned the Pacheco fight, because
it's not an easy fight.
That fight's gonna take some sort of toll on its own. I would have to think, and like in that case, I hopefully, it seems obviously like both of them want it. Obviously, both of them know how big and important of a fight it would be. Hopefully just Cyborg she's just, I feel like obviously otherwise she's up to the challenge, but, hopefully this fight with Pacheco goes well, and then maybe like with Cyborg, just one last go, and one of the arguably the biggest women's fight we've seen in a long time. And that would be, Cyborg's obviously no stranger to some of the biggest women's fights of all time.
For sure.
She has it. Yeah, she's got this chance to add another one to her legendary resume.
And for it to be outside of the UFC would be so huge for the PFL and what they're trying to do.
Especially, I think it's especially for Kayla Harrison too, to have that kind of spotlight on her, like a kind of spotlight that I feel like she's definitely commanded for a while now. I think she would obviously get it here, and then I think she would put on a show. But I mean, just in terms of, I think we should we're definitely gonna dig into the
Yeah.
style matchup between the two, and
I'm
that's
glad
where,
you got into that.
yeah, that's where things get really fun. Obviously, you get the thumping, striking of Cyborg. Kayla Harrison's just absolute suffocating grappling. Like, it's really just about, like, yeah, which one, who's gonna outlast the other, and how. And I mean, if we can get a full fight of that, then yeah, there's no doubt. This would definitely, yeah, we would definitely see some sort of, you know, like, yeah, restoration and huge women's fights happening again.
Yeah, I think the hype would come back. And I feel like part of that too has just been because, obviously Alexa Grasso upset Valentina Shevchenko, who's a huge star. Amanda Nunes retired. And like, since then, it seems like we've been waiting on these bigger stars to build, which I think they will. And they kind of already are in a sense because I feel like we're starting to see like more fans
Yeah,
get behind these big fights.
yeah, and it's definitely, it can't, it can't be the fighters themselves. Like, they clearly want these fights and whatnot. It's really, yeah, it's just up to the promotion and whatnot to, like, really put that emphasis on it. And so, yeah, with the UFC 300 fight and then this fight, like,
Well, allegedly.
allegedly.
It could be. That's just, like I said, no sources. That's just a hunch. Because it just would make sense. Like I said, when you book the two clear flyweight contenders right before one of the biggest events, it would make sense to have a great champ versus champ fight that both of them seemingly want. And at 115, it just makes sense because I think Tatiana Suarez too, she has a fight booked, and that's really the only person I could think of who would be fighting for the strawweight title at this point. Let me just double check that. I think, yeah, she's fighting Amanda Lemos at UFC 298. So maybe, like, that's really the last person I could see right now for that would get in the way of that fight happening, because she's the only strawweight contender right now that I would see that's like deserving of a shot. And like I said, the two at flyweight are fighting each other. It lines up perfectly for this champ versus champ fight, which I think would be cool. Plus, it's like another interesting stylistic matchup because Grasso, I mean, she's originally a strawweight, so she's not like the biggest flyweight in the world, and obviously Zhang is just a tank at 115. It'd be crazy to see her at 125. It's crazy. I mean, I know we started this conversation with Cyborg versus Harrison, but that's obviously another fight that I hope we see. And like you said, if all these things go the way we're hoping that they go, I think that this could be a huge year for women's MMA coming up in 2024. But in general, I think it's going to be a huge year for the sport in 2024. We have obviously UFC 300 coming up. I think there's going to be so many crazy fights for the UFC throughout the year. We obviously still have boxing. Fury versus Usyk is going to be happening in February. And now we get to see where the PFL is going to stack up as it really starts to pick up stride in 2024.
Yeah, UFC's post-USADA era.
That too.
I guess at the time of this video has begun, but it is beginning.
Yeah, man. I'm curious to see how that goes. It's big year, so many storylines. We hope you guys stick with us to talk about them and break them all down, because we'll be here doing it no matter what. So hope you guys enjoyed, and let us know what fights you guys want to see down in the comments. And until next time, we'll see y'all.
Feels just like a superstar. Doing all these drugs, I don't think I'm gonna see tomorrow. Living fast, brand new dash up in a foreign car. This the type of shit that you be doing when you going hard.